So, Molly, I'm not sure if you know this, but I have a guilty weekend pleasure, and I hope it doesn't offend you or our CityLab colleagues. I get the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal delivered to my house every Saturday morning. And while my girls run around like maniacs, I try to carve out 10 minutes to sip my coffee, and I read Dan Neal's auto column, The Rumble Seat.
Wait, hold on. You read an auto column? That's like a thing people do? Read about cars?
I know. Well, I knew you'd give me grief about it, but I got hooked on him because he was an early booster of electric cars, Mal. And not because they'll save the planet, but because he said they're going to kick every other car's ass. So earlier this year, Dan wrote this amazing article where he outed himself as a full-on climate warrior. And actually, he gave me the idea for our episode today.
All right.
So I called Dan on the phone and I asked him to tell me about his plans. You'll hear for yourself, they go way beyond electric cars.
After having my power knocked out a half a dozen times by hurricanes in the past 3 years, I decided that I wanted emergency backup power in my house. So then I looked, okay, I'm going to have a backup battery. But then I realized there was a solar power credit this year. And so I said, well, I'll just add solar panels. It's grid tied so that I can't run out of electricity. And it is renewable on a daily basis so that I hopefully zero out my electrical consumption. And I can use electricity to charge my car. I don't own an electric car yet, but I do have the charger. I'm ready.
So, Molly, let me break it down for you. So Dan's going to install this battery in his home in Raleigh. It's not just going to power the car, but the entire house, right? That battery is going to be powered by solar panels and it's going to be tied to the grid when needed. But what's interesting to me, it's not really about the car or the solar panels. It's about the batteries. They're what kind of holds the whole thing together. They connect the solar panels and the car, and they're what actually enable someone like Dan, really any of us, to ride out a hurricane without losing power, to drive cars without carbon guzzling, and to make sure we're always using zero-emission energy, which is like a big deal. So I'm betting that these energy-storing juggernauts aren't just going to transform Dan's house in Raleigh, but Raleigh itself and, frankly, all cities around the world, around the country.
That's a big bet. I mean, the only battery that I pay any attention to these days is the battery in my phone, which keeps dying all the time, which can't be a great omen for a battery-run city.
Well, actually, cell phone batteries are relatively insignificant jokes in comparison with the batteries I'm talking about. We'll get into it on today's episode, Battery City. It's all about how energy storage can change everything, about how we turn the lights to how we get around town, and can make it possible to meet the electrified, greener future that we need.
Okay, I guess that's what I deserve for hosting a show with a hardcore energy nerd. But all right, I'm on board to find out some more after the break, so stay with us. Welcome to Technopolis, where technology is disrupting, remaking, and sometimes overrunning our cities. I'm Molly Turner. I teach urban innovation at the Berkeley Haas School of Business, and I was the first policy person at Airbnb.
And I'm Jim Kapsis. I was a climate negotiator in the Obama administration, and now I advise tech startups. Today we're diving into the battery-operated future. And fortunately, we have two great tour guides. John Zahurancik, the COO of Fluence, a global energy storage company. John helped pioneer some of the world's first grid-connected batteries.
We'll also talk to Rushad Nanavatty, a principal at the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is an advocacy group that promotes the transition to a clean energy future. And he works closely with cities to help them fight climate change. Okay, but hold on for a second. I'd just like to understand this for sure. The kind of batteries that we're talking about, they're not like the battery in my iPhone or my computer or my flashlight. These are batteries that are powering entire cities, right? I mean, like a much bigger scale.
Yeah, you got it. I mean, we're going to need these big boys if cities ever want to meet their 100% renewable energy goals or survive the extreme weather events like nasty hurricanes, polar vortexes, you name it, that we won't be able to avoid. Climate change, if you haven't heard, is real.
What?
It's true, and we're going to need a much bolder set of solutions than just asking everyone to turn the thermostat down.
Well, that's good, because turning down my thermostat isn't going to do a whole lot anyway. My monthly electric bill is only $13.
What are you doing, reading by candlelight? No wonder your phone battery's always dying. You barely use any energy to charge it.
California, baby, but you've got my attention, all right? Climate change is terrifying. But before we get to the climate-saving possibilities, I'm going to need some help on the fundamentals.
Okay, shoot.
First, I have to admit, I actually have no idea what happens when I turn on the lights. I flip the switch and it just works, which is great, but how does it work?
Wow. We're really starting at the beginning here.
Yeah.
Well, listen, the most important thing to know is that every time you flip a switch or plug in a device, you're making an instant request to the grid for more energy. So it only makes more energy because you're asking for it. It doesn't have pre-made energy on standby that it made overnight when it wasn't getting so many requests. And this kind of on-demand system is super inefficient.
This seems really problematic for a renewable energy future, right? The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So without batteries, I flip the switch to make a smoothie and nada?
No smoothie for you, Mal. But it's also just scratching the surface. I'm not overselling it to say I don't think that batteries are essential if we're going to get to a clean energy promised land.
I'm having a hard time seeing how batteries, the things that A, run out all the time, B, always need to be replaced or jumped. Isn't that what you car people say?
Yes.
Or C, I can't throw away in the garbage because they're toxic. Anyway, how are those things going to make the world cleaner or more efficient?
All right, fine. I can see you're not going to take my word for it. Fair enough. So I'm going to bring in the big guns. And by big guns, I mean John Zahurancik of Fluence, who is truly fluent in batteries.
Oh, that was a bad one, Jim.
I'm a dad. It's just too easy. I can't help myself.
What a battery lets you do is not have to produce everything in that instant. So if you think about if you build a computer, you're not building a computer the instant somebody buys the computer. You might be building it a little bit ahead, and they're ready for that surge in demand, and they use a warehouse. And so a battery on the power grid is really something like adding a warehouse to the power system, right?
Huh.
Just think about other things you consume. If you always had to pay somebody to drop whatever they're doing to instantly make what you needed at that time, they're going to charge you a premium to do that, and they're not going to be able to do it in the most efficient manner. They're going to have to do it instantaneously, which means sometimes when the system's already busy, we have to turn on power plants that are old, dirty, expensive.
So these are like our emergency power plants that are off most of the time, and then we just turn them on at
a couple days a year because everyone's using air conditioning. Yeah,
it is. And what you find if you look at a power system like the United States is there's a huge number of power plants that run less than 5% of the year.
Wow.
But they occupy land 100% of the year, and we pay for them to exist 100% of the year.
You want to get rid of those peaker plants. They're expensive and they're dirty.
So how do batteries get rid of those peaker plants?
There are a lot of people that worry about keeping the power grid up and running. Those people are now beginning to say, well, maybe I don't need the plant. I can put this large-scale battery in. It can do the job of that peaking plant that I was going to put in, and I can use it for other things every day. So it's a cost savings relative to what I would have ordinarily built, and I'm using all of the rest of the electric infrastructure so much better.
So there's a cost savings. You're not building these power plants anymore that are dirty and expensive. A lot of that's invisible, right, to the average person living in a city. I mean, this is interesting to know what's happening behind the scenes, but what will people see or feel that might be different in their daily lives because of battery technology?
Well, in the United States, we have a pretty reliable system overall, and so we don't often have to deal with outages. But I think as the infrastructure is getting older,
you've been in my neighborhood.
You must have a lot of trees. But it's the same kind of thing that we're seeing with bridges and roads and other things that we built 40, 50, 60 years ago. These investments are wearing out. There has to be a period of reinvestment. And ultimately, we don't want to rebuild the system of the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. We want to take advantage of things that have advanced, and batteries are one of the things that have advanced. And then the other thing that happens is as we're bringing more and more of our sources of power coming from renewable generation, most of the sources of renewable generation we have, they're not as predictable
Solar,
as the thermal
wind,
power plant. Yeah, so the sun shines when it shines, except clouds come over sometimes.
And the wind blows when it blows, except when it doesn't.
Except when it doesn't. And so we're getting better at predicting those things and forecasting them, but there's still a lot of variability, and we have to compensate for that variability with something. You can flip your lights on, and if it turns on, but 3 minutes later it turns off, and then it turns back on, and it flickers over. That's really not the type of service you're going to deal with.
And with extreme weather events, because of climate change, you have new problems, right? There was I was talking to some folks recently that in the Midwest, when this polar vortex hit recently, the swing of temperature was so fierce that some of the wind farms just shut down. Like they stopped working. And if you have batteries, presumably, if you have enough batteries with enough storage capability, you can keep the heat on.
That's right.
Right.
You can ride through those periods of rapid change. Actually, that's one of the best examples of what batteries do well. They deal with very fast change really, really well, whereas a lot of these other things don't. And so, when you have a very rapid change from a sunny day to gloom coming in, you are eventually going to have to ramp up some of those thermal power plants to compensate. But the time that it takes you to ramp those up versus the time that it takes the cloud to come over, they don't match very well.
John, isn't it true that like a place like California, and I know I've read this is true in Hawaii, where there's just so much solar penetration, particularly like distributed people's houses.
Sure.
That you get to a point with having so much solar that the grid doesn't even know what to do with it. In fact, it'll break the grid.
That's right.
People are generating so much power through solar panels on their roofs that the grid can't contain it all. That's a good problem to have.
They don't. Well, maybe yes. It's a good problem theoretically if you have a way of solving it.
Right.
Which, if you have a battery, you can store that power. Right now, it goes on the grid. So Hawaii, right, which I've heard is sort of the postcard. People refer to it in the industry as the postcard from the future of like,
that's right.
Be careful what you wish for. Which is now there's so much solar that they're actually telling people if you want solar on your roof, you have to be able to not send it to the grid.
That's right.
But so if we have this problem with cities that have a lot of solar power, does that mean that batteries are going to be more useful in some kind of cities than others? What kind of cities are going to benefit from batteries most, John?
Yeah, I think it does mean that the places where we have the leading edge of renewables are places where batteries have a bigger impact. That said, we've been doing batteries. I've been putting batteries on the grid for over a decade now. And some of the places we did this had nothing to do with renewables. They just were places that had high costs of power or they had very inefficient power plants. And so we've been able to replace those. But I think more and more we see as cities and areas push into renewables, the areas that are leading that these kind of operational grid challenges are coming up more acutely. And so that's where batteries really can have a big impact. And one, they'll go in, and this is what's happening today at the power grid level, but they're also starting to go in at the customer level. And so if I'm a business operator and I have a very critical process, I might be high-speed printing of newspapers, or I might be some kind of a chemical process that can't have interruption. I'm putting storage in to give me more quality of service in some cases. If I run big pumps and through the day and I get charged because I have a spike in my usage at one time of the day, I can put the storage in. I avoid that spike at that time, and then I don't get those charges because I'm basically using electric power more efficiently or more smoothly.
What could go wrong here? There's got to be some downsides to these batteries.
No, they're perfect.
I've got some questions too because I'm into it, but I also have some questions and we'll get to it.
What could go wrong, John?
The things that we've seen go wrong, I guess I'll start there. There have been people that have tried to do batteries before. And in some cases, the technology really wasn't ready. California did some things, Alaska, Puerto Rico.
They didn't last long enough.
They just didn't last long enough to make the investment worthwhile. Today, we're in an entirely different state of batteries. We're using these same kind of technologies that are in your phone, in your laptop, and so on. They're much more efficient. They last a lot longer.
Is there ever going to be a future where there's going to be a battery in my building?
Yeah, I think so. And some buildings are already moving that way. So
like my building can be its own little mini power plant.
That's right. Yeah, up to some point. And so you probably won't have it deliver everything that building needs, but it's really about smoothing out these, surge peak periods, right? When you can smooth those things out, it has a cost savings throughout the whole system. And that cost savings also generally translates into an emissions reduction too.
So then how electric is our future? For example, like right now, I don't own a car, but my friends' cars are a combination of gas and electric. They're hybrid.
Sure.
My heat is natural gas. I guess my lights are electric. Is that mix going to be different? Are we going to have more electricity powering our lives in the future?
I think so. I think you're going to see transportation become electrified, and we're just at the beginning of that.
I hope so.
And I think the reason, if you look around, almost every other sector is electrified. Even buildings are largely electrified. And in some cases you have gas heating and those kinds of things. But many things have electrified over time, and I think it's just because other forms of power are less effective and more expensive.
Is the relationship that we have with the electricity, with the grid, is it going to change as like individuals because of battery technology and I guess other technologies you're describing?
I think it's not just batteries. I think what batteries are giving us is another mode of control. And, what we're seeing is information technology is giving us a lot of visibility into how to see that, how to see our own consumption patterns.
The cheapest thing you can do to lower emissions is use less power.
Right.
Be energy efficient, right? And so if I now have solar and a battery, why do I need to invest in, insulation in my house or be more efficient? And now I'm just going to consume more and more and more. And I got the grid there too. And so could it actually lead to have a perverse consequence? Induce more demand for electricity?
I think so, but I guess you have to think about what you think is important. I mean, to the extent that this is, work being generated that produces something at some level, then that has a benefit too. So I guess you have to decide how you think about.
I'm talking about my third beer fridge that I don't need is what I'm talking about, right? I mean, this is America, John, right? I need 3 refrigerators and 5 cars. Well, not Molly, but not me either. To be clear,
for every person like you that needs a 3rd and 4th beer fridge, I think you find that there's somebody that's creating a business based on low cost electricity that's generating something productive, or they're creating services that didn't exist before. So I think you have to take it in the whole. I guess would be my view on it. I think what electricity has allowed us to do in a lot of cases is become much more productive. And so we're able to create more food than we were able to create before. We're able to provide better healthcare than we were able to create before. We're able to educate people at a level we couldn't do efficiently before. When you look at all of the levels of human experience that the United Nations measures, and they look at things like the overall quality of life, you can find a correlation between electric consumption and the highest levels of quality of life. And a basic amount of electricity kind of gets you to a standard, and most of the world has that standard. But when you find the upper levels of life expectancy, educational achievement, productivity, and kind of levels of income, you find a very direct correlation with electric consumption. And I think it's because it's a very efficient form of work.
Stay right here for more from me and Jim. We'll be back right after the break. Wow, that was an education. The part that really stuck with me were those peaker plants and the potential for batteries to replace those inefficient, polluting dinosaurs. I had no idea that there were whole power plants in our cities that just sat around waiting to be used.
I know. The first time I heard about peaker plants, it just totally blew my mind. They're bad news for so many reasons, and I think it's one of the real compelling benefits of batteries.
But I wonder what it'd be like to live next door to one of these battery farms that replace the peaker plants. I can't picture it.
Well, yeah, I think, other than a landfill or a jail, I don't think anything's worse than, a worse neighbor than a power plant.
Yeah, true.
But you know what I was really excited by? I loved how John talked about electricity, meaning like greater productivity and better quality of life. We often lose sight of that. That was the whole point of electricity in the first place.
I'm always a little worried when I hear techies talk about greater productivity. They promise it's going to make our lives better, but it just means we have to work faster. I can hardly keep up as it is. And more than how I feel about this, I'm also worried that this cheaper, more productive form of energy is going to create some induced demand. I mean, we talk about induced demand on this show a lot. We've talked about it with autonomous vehicles and ride-hailing, right?
Yeah.
When we make cars easier, that just makes people use them more. Doesn't the same law apply to energy use? Are we all going to go back to electric can openers just because we can?
Well, I wouldn't overstress about this. I mean, I understand the concern. We need to, make sure that we don't kind of go backwards. But let's step back for a second. Like, batteries are going to help deliver cheaper and more reliable energy for all kinds of folks. Like think about Dan in storm-hit North Carolina, who gets to keep his lights on and enjoy his air conditioning, even after the hurricane. Not to mention, folks can go to work, they can keep the hospitals running and keep them, doing their job of saving lives. Like, I don't want to worry ourselves away from the potential to be less reliant on fossil fuels and to bring prices down for people. Like, that's the clean energy future we all want. Let's not stress out about it. Let's get there.
All right. You're starting to talk about the big picture implications about all of this, and I like where this conversation is going. So why don't we follow up on that? I still want to know more about how batteries are going to impact the global scene, and not just for the gearheads like Dan or sun-soaked places like Hawaii and Phoenix.
Yeah, with the ways we produce and consume energy, they have much larger implications, especially serious geopolitical ones. That's why I got into sustainability in the first place, Mal, because I realized how much our energy issues were contributing to political instability all over the world. I think batteries are a net positive, but there's still a lot to learn about their global implications. Who wins when batteries take over our grid, and who might lose out?
This is exactly why I'm glad we had a chance to talk to Rushad from the Rocky Mountain Institute. He's an expert on clean energy tech and works with cities all over the world. And we started by asking him about the batteries we use right now, lithium-ion batteries, and whether we really want to go long with that particular technology. So if we're now creating thousands and thousands or millions of batteries that are going to be scattered all over our buildings and powering everything distributively, that's a lot of batteries. And when I hear the word lithium-ion battery, the first thing I think about is all these cell phone batteries that are horrible for the environment when we get rid of our cell phones.
Lithium-ion battery technology is clearly the dominant battery technology today. What we don't want to do is bet the future on lithium-ion batteries. I think it's going to be really, really important that we explore and develop other alternative battery technologies that draw on a more diverse set of resources and materials.
Where are the materials coming from for the lithium-ion battery?
A crucial element in their construction is a mineral called cobalt. 2/3 of the world's cobalt supply is based in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This may have been a couple of years ago. The Economist ran a story about the use of child labor in these mines. So these are really, really poorly regulated, and that comes with a whole host of human rights and local environmental problems. That's deeply, deeply problematic. And 80% of the supply chain, when you consider both sort of mining and refining capacity, sits with China.
How do we get around that?
We're seeing a move in that direction. There was a 500% jump in investment in early stage battery technologies in 2017, 2018.
Yeah, but Bill Gates has famously invested millions in new types of battery technologies, but we haven't, none of them have really paid off yet.
But there are, I think, enough irons in the fire to believe that several other alternative battery technologies that are not too far away from commercialization. And what's interesting here is that the people making these investments aren't your VCs with really, really short sort of investment horizons. A lot of this is really, really patient capital that is very accustomed to making really big bets.
And you've spent a lot of time, right, working on energy issues all over the world. So tell us, what's the impact going to be in developing cities?
So I think there's huge potential to leapfrog investments in a traditional electricity system. Nobody is investing in coal-fired power plants right now in the US, but people are still investing in coal-fired power plants in the developing world, including countries that would not ever build a coal-fired power plant in their own countries. And that's deeply problematic. And part of it is driven by the fact that policymakers do not fully appreciate the fact that alternatives are available to them. But we have the opportunity here now to essentially leapfrog traditional grid investments and move to a more distributed system. There are still, perhaps 1 billion people around the world who do not have access to reliable electricity today. And so, the default option is run a massive transition line hundreds of miles from a centralized generation facility. That doesn't make sense in today's world. It makes a lot more sense to employ a microgrid with a combination of renewables and energy storage essentially to power these communities. There's several hospitals that are microgrids. In research stations in remote areas are microgrids. And now you're increasingly seeing them in small islands or in rural communities in places like India and Africa. Still really, really early stages.
So, in other words, it's not just these big developed cities that are upgrading to this new technology. It's rural areas in developing countries that don't even have an outdated grid to upgrade are building these new state-of-the-art grids with batteries.
I wish they were building them. It's happening a very, very small degree, but it can and should be happening to a much, much larger degree.
And what's standing in the way of that? Why isn't it happening there yet?
Part of it is that just a sheer lack of knowledge and understanding about the potential for these technologies. And then you're up against some really strong incumbents. The electricity system in many countries, many places around the world is still a monopoly business that has done things a certain way for decades. And this represents pretty significant and disruptive change. And there's always going to be resistance to something like that.
10 years from now, if things go in the direction that you hope they go, how do batteries change daily life for the average person in a city?
In a few different ways, and I'll go from kind of macro to micro. One, the climate impact potential here is huge. And so at a global level, that's one impact that you're going to see. At a community level, you're going to have a much more resilient energy system, electricity system. And then at the individual household level, if we get this right, you're going to see a radical reduction in how much you're paying for electricity and energy. Policymakers and regulators need to play a much, much more active market-making role. Even in the most sort of deregulated, liberalized electricity markets in the world, you still have really, really strong monopolies. And for good reason. Utility companies are very, very good at delivering relatively cheap, usually very reliable electricity. But what the world needs is a completely decarbonized electricity system. We have the technology to get us there, and we have the technology to get us there in a way that makes perfect economic sense. But our market structures and regulation need to enable
We need disruption.
That.
We need to disrupt, existing business models. We need of utilities. We need new regulatory frameworks, new incentive structures to accelerate this transition if we actually deeply care about solving some of these problems related to climate change.
We can build, in most climate zones in the US today, a home that essentially produces more energy, electricity, than it consumes at a very, very small cost premium. And that the payback period associated with that premium in most cases would be under a year. So any additional investment that you make in building that house essentially would pay itself back within a year in terms of your reduced energy costs.
But the challenge, right, Rushad, the challenge with that, and I agree with you. I agree with you. We want to get there. The challenge when we talk to developers in the construction industry, folks don't have a lot of experience building those buildings. And there isn't the supply chain really to support building those buildings yet. So while it's certainly feasible, the industries hasn't transformed yet.
Yeah, but the industry transforms in response to signals from the market or signals from regulators, right? And so I would argue that in this case, that's the right approach.
Molly, I'm on board with pushing the whole construction industry to build only net zero homes, meaning that they consume only as much energy as they produce through, renewables like rooftop solar. But batteries can turbocharge these buildings by making sure they consume every last drop of renewable power that they generate, even when the sun isn't shining. But I've got to say it's not nearly as simple as Rushad suggests to transform that industry. People in real estate and construction are used to doing things a certain way. I think home builders need to realize that someday soon, they're not just going to be building homes, they're going to be building charging stations and power plants.
Yeah, and city incentives and state laws can actually force that change. We'll also need more ambitious building codes and governments that require these buildings to install solar panels like we did in California.
And cities can lead by example by committing to build only net zero buildings like schools, libraries, and fire stations.
But I want to make sure we address the point that Rushad made about lithium-ion batteries. We can't keep relying on that particular incumbent technology. It just doesn't cut it. Its lifespan is too short. There are clearly geopolitical risks and real human rights concerns in places like the DRC. I mean, what good is a bright new future if it's created in the darkness? That never turns out well.
Molly, I think this is a place for innovation. I mean, Apple, for example, they've got a real incentive to get in there and find a new battery tech that they can scale. But that's the point, right? Like, this is a problem that's ripe for a solution. That's why I'm excited about it. Now, if we only can make it more exciting to a bigger audience, maybe if The Rock starred in some summer blockbuster and batteries saved the day and he's carrying them up a skyscraper, then we'd really be somewhere.
All right, Jim, I started this episode not so sure that batteries are going to be all that world-changing. After all, with my electric bill, a lower bill isn't going to have that big of an impact on my life.
Which I just want to underline is a minority position. Most people would love to lower their electric bill.
All right, but I like that batteries could keep my lights on when we have the next big earthquake and all the power lines are down. And I love the idea of cleaner air, of course, when batteries replace those awful pollution-spewing peaker plants. But I still think it's going to be an uphill battle to get anyone who hasn't been listening to this episode care about or even notice what batteries can do for the world. I mean, when you switch on the light, it still turns on. So how are you going to notice the difference?
Trust me, Molly, people are going to love batteries. I mean, reliable power, cleaner air, more control over how we get, use, and pay for our power. Yes, please. Very few of us can choose where we get our energy from. If our local monopoly utility is green and reliable, then lucky us. But if they're not, we're stuck. So I think once consumers get a taste for more control, whether to keep their lights on after a big storm or to sell excess solar power to the grid, they're going to like it, and they're going to demand more of it.
Okay, I agree, but I still don't think that demand from individuals or just innovation from the private sector is going to be enough to bring us this battery-powered future you're so excited about. The system seemed too big and entrenched. I mean, this is exactly what government is made for. They could clear the way for batteries and help them take over our tired grid.
Yeah, and city leaders in particular, they have good reason to push for this. From securing critical infrastructure like hospitals and schools against extreme weather events to meeting their ambitious climate goals they've set. They're going to need batteries in the mix. And like governments all over the world that are concerned about economic development and developing cities, they're going to care about it too.
All right. Well, while we're waiting for the world to get behind all of this, I'm actually thinking that batteries could be the beginning of a new lifestyle for me. I mean, look, I'm in no hurry to become a car owner, but if anything's going to make that happen, it's the possibility of driving carbon-free.
Well, I, for one, am taking notes from Dan, and I'm excited about the innovations that could truly bring us to the renewable energy future that we all need, and at least most of us want. It's as simple as storing all the energy we make, which means batteries are the perfect answer to that annoying straw man people sometimes make about renewables.
What, you mean good luck with solar panels on a cloudy day?
Yeah, I don't need luck, thanks. I'll use my battery. It's time to bid you farewell from Technopolis. Before we do, I want to note that I work in and around green energy, and so companies I advise may occasionally do business with batteries. Meet us back here next week when we uncover why a housing app scared the bejesus out of Seattle.
It's a case of disruption overload on the next installment of Technopolis. Until then, I'm Molly Turner.
And I'm Jim Kapsis. Nicole Flato is a CityLab editor and our source of endless energy. Virginia Laura is our associate producer, and Lizzie Jacobs is our executive producer.
Josh Rogozin is our engineer, and our theme music is by Copilot.
Thanks to the CityLab staff for their helpful input, and to Robin Beavers of Blueprint Power and Rowan Ma of Tesla for their insights as we research the world of batteries.
For more on battery-powered cities and other topics relevant to our urban lives, head to citylab.com. And don't miss out on a single episode. Subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to listen. And tell a friend.